to be talking about natural language processing for productivity purposes. So we're going to be talking about the technical aspects of natural language processing, what it is, where it comes from. We're going to get into how everything works as well, and we're going to talk about how you can use it personally to boost your own productivity and make your tasks a little bit easier. So let's get into it. All right. So let's talk about natural language processing. So before we get into the actual aspect of natural language processing, I would like to talk about artificial intelligence as the prelude. So when it comes to artificial intelligence, there are three main categories. When we're speaking mathematically, that is, there's fuzzy logic, there's genetic algorithms, and there's neural networks. So I'll talk briefly about fuzzy logic and genetic algorithms, but neural networks is what we're really interested in today. So what is fuzzy logic besides from the thing you've seen written on your washing machine sometime? Well, to put it simply, fuzzy logic is the idea that we can represent logic not as these predefined values, but as human understandable concepts. For example, in the programming of your washing machine, it would be, hey, do something when the water level is at 20 centimeters. Instead of that, what if we could program do something when the water level is high? And then we have to define what a high water level is. And we define that using fuzzy logic. Genetic algorithms are algorithms that are based on evolution. So you create the basic idea behind it is that you create an algorithm for performing a certain task, and then you create multiple algorithms, and then you sort them by the most effective ones, and then you take traits from the most effective ones to develop a further generation. So it works just as evolution does. The genetics of the parents are transferred and selectively bred in a way to create more efficient and more desirable algorithms. Neural networks are extremely complicated, and the actual inner workings of neural networks are a topic for maybe an entire series of lectures, not just a tech talk. But when it comes to the basics of it, neural networks are based on the actual neurons in the brain. So you can see here in this image, what we've done is we've mathematically modeled how the actual neurons and synapses in our brain work using mathematical functions. So they are more of a black box rather than fuzzy logic or genetic algorithms. They are not easy to understand once they are constructed, but they are ruthlessly efficient in performing extremely complex but well-defined tasks. So then, what's natural language processing? So here's a definition from IBM. Natural language processing refers to a branch of computer science, and more specifically the branch of artificial intelligence, concerned with giving computers the ability to understand text and spoken words in much the same way that human beings can. To simplify that, it's what Alan Turing talked about when he talked about the imitation game. It's the idea of getting computers to understand and respond using actual words, actual human language. So the IBM site is a great resource if you want to, get into the technical aspects of this. They have some great definitions and resources over there. So definitely check that out if you are interested. So let's talk about what the tasks that are associated with natural language processing. So here's three of them, and these are just three of many. So the first one is named entity recognition. So what's named entity recognition? Well, it's the simple idea that a computer recognizes something by name. So let's say we were talking about ConceptVines, so it would understand that ConceptVines is an entity or company, and it would be able to call back to that in the manner of speech, and in normal just conversation. Sentiment analysis is something that's very um, quite interesting. It's the idea that computers can analyze human emotions. So this works best. The best applications I've seen of this are in text messaging applications. Some text messaging applications can tell what kind of how you're feeling, whether that text you just wrote was angry or sentimental or hopeful or sad, and that's the art of sentiment analysis. And of course, that leads us to natural language generation. This is, of course, what we are concerned with today with ChatGPT. It's the idea that computers can talk back and express, well, not express the ideas. That's a bit of a stretch. We're not creating consciousness here, but that they can respond to human inputs using natural language, using human language and human syntax. That's the idea of natural language generation. So let's talk about what sets ChatGPT apart from natural language processing algorithms that preceded it. Um, and the major part of that is deep learning, right? So a deep learning network is a network of it's a neural network that's three or more layers deep. So we discussed neurons before. So you will have neurons layered on top of neurons for at least three layers, right? And the way that deep learning works is that you use you you generate the algorithms, but the generation itself is unsupervised. It's unguided to an extent. So we don't care about how it's done in this scenario. We only care about the result, and the algorithm that gets us the best results, the neural network get that gets us the most results, is the likely one that we're going to be using. So one of the disadvantages, or some might even say advantages, with this is that it results in these black boxes. The neural networks that come out of these don't really make sense to us. They're just as complex as the neurons in our brains. It's trying to understand how people think, but with computers, right? So you can't predict the output of it. You can't just pen it down on paper and just do the math on it. It's that complicated. You never know what the output is going to be, and in many cases, and ChatGPT included, there will be a level of randomness in the answers. So um, and this isn't just to do with natural language processing, right? Again, this is like artificial intelligence and natural language processing is used everywhere. The YouTube algorithm, or social media algorithms in general, are great examples of this. No one knows how the YouTube algorithm works. Just a complete black box, and YouTube themselves have to tweak it all the time. Just add hard coded exceptions to some categories when they deem them less than desirable. Right. So I gave an introduction to deep learning before, but let's get into the mathematics of how it actually works. As you can see here, I don't understand any of this, so I'm going to simplify massively and give my own explanation instead of this one. So deep learning algorithms are at their core simple programs, right? You have an input, there's a function, and you get an output, right? The way that it differs is how we define that function. As we said before, they work like neurons. Um, you give your input into the neural network, and then the neurons fire in their order and in the pattern, and then you interpret the answers as their final nodes, at your final neutrons, as the output, right? So how deep learning changes that up is that you generate a neural network to perform function fx. You run that with a data set, so you have a bunch of inputs, and that could be a sample data set of 10 to millions based on what you're trying to do. And this neural network that you generated will give you a function, and it will give you an output. Then you grade that output. So based on that output, based on the grade that you give that output, um, this neural network will evolve, using certain methods. There's a method called backpropagation, and what it will do is it will adjust the values and the strengths of those neurons, and based on that, the actual function will change and the output will change, and you keep tweaking that, and you keep tweaking that until your output is satisfactory. And that brings us to the actual theory behind ChatGPT, which is the large language model, right? Um, so what is a large language model? Um, it's it's basically a massive neural network, and it will have just tons and tons of training data based on multiple language sources, right? And the way it works is it's very simple, right? Imagine it as an autocorrect on steroid, just trying to guess what the next word is, but trained on just such a large data set and using such a vast amount of computing power that what it's generating, unlike autocorrect, actually makes sense, right? And in the process of training, because we use such large data sets, it can quote unquote memorize large amounts of data, and it can replicate human language almost perfectly, right? And when we're using such large data sets, weird things can happen, right? For example, the one of the things that these large language models run into is something called hallucination, where the answers and the output it generates resemble nothing from what the original source that it was trained from actually said, right? And this leads to very interesting behaviors and patterns within these large language models. And I think we'll see a few examples with ChatGPT when we get to that section today as well. So let's get down to what GPT is, right? So GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And what that means, it's basically a neural network that uses large language model, and it's pre-trained using a certain data set. So the first GPT that was created, it used a very small sample size, just 4.5 gigabytes, and it got all this data from unpublished books. So it not a great data set. And I haven't actually seen GPT in action, but I've heard it's pretty rough, right? So GPT-2 was introduced, and that already introduced a massive bump up from GPT-1. So this was trained from 40 gigabytes of text. So when you consider that's just plain text, that's a lot of data that is being fed. And the training dataset and the parameter count was incremented by 10. So GPT-2 was actually seeing use for a while. It was being used in very interesting experiments. One that I was particularly interested in was a subreddit simulator, which was GPT-2 based. There was a GPT-2 based version, and what that did was it generated posts and comments just as humans would do, based on certain communities, whether that was humor or cars or fashion, and it was just bots talking to each other, and to an outsider it could look completely human. I mean, they would post nonsense most of the time, but their mannerisms and their speaking and their language, that all of that made sense. Right? Um, so behind the scenes, this GPT-3 was being worked on, and GPT-3's dataset absolutely dwarfs everything else, right? 570 gigabytes of data, and that includes the entirety of Wikipedia. So if you're wondering, how ChatGPT knows everything, that's why it memorized Wikipedia basically. And GPT-3 isn't actually new. Well, it's not as new as people are going on about. It was actually released, well, not released, but it was actually given in preview about 3 years ago. Um, Probably not 5 years, around 3 years ago. Um, but it was a closed API, and it was a closed API for a reason, and the reason was because it was so good. People were basically the people behind it were basically scared that what's happening now would happen, and people would use it to replace writers and cheat on exams and everything. Um, but this isn't a moral discussion, but so we'll leave that for a different day. So GPT-3 was released, and ChatGPT was based on GPT-3 and GPT 3.5. But currently, I believe releases support up to GPT-4, and I'm not sure what GPT-4's training dataset looks like, but for the capabilities I've seen are incredible. It can analyze photographs, and it's just on a completely different level. Um, but even ChatGPT, which the initial release, which ran on GPT-3, was completely incredible in regard with regards to what it could do compared to previous chatbots. Um, right. With that being said, let's get into the capabilities of ChatGPT, and let's get into the demo. So, what can you do with ChatGPT? Well, first of all, it's a chatbot, so you can ask it questions. In fact, let's ask it about its research dataset, since that's what we were talking about. Well, that's a pretty comprehensive write-up. And as you can see, as we discussed before, it generates the words one after the other, just like an autocorrect. Just predicting what the next word should be based on the context and the previous outputs. All right, let's take a look at what it said here. There's a disclaimer against legal info advice. I think that's based on recent events if you've been keeping up with the news. Um, but it's not specific, so let's ask it again what exactly it was trained on. Okay, here you go. There are books, websites, other texts, and I've seen it mention Wikipedia as well when given this prompt. So it never replies the same way twice. I guess that's due to an element of randomness built in. So yeah, that's the general knowledge part. Obviously, it has a broad general knowledge on itself, as well as related topics with regards to its development, including AI. So let's ask it something a bit out of left field. I've started a new chat now, which means the previous context is gone. Um, so whatever I say, this is a fresh chat. So a fresh chat GPT. So let's ask it something about astrophysics. All right, that's quite a large write-up, much more than what I was expecting. Um, so since this is a language model, we can ask them to rewrite and tweak this as required. So let's ask it to summarize these. Um, as you can see, it did a really good job of that. And if you go through each of these points, I'm sure you'll find the mapping between these points is quite excellent. It's quite good at keeping track of things, but it does get things mixed up. For example, in some cases, maybe point one isn't actually what point one was in the original text. Um, so that's a limitation of GPT models. It tends to make very human mistakes at times. It is based on artificial neurons in the end. So again, as we can manipulate this, we can do some pretty fun things with it. Let's ask it to write it out in slang. Okay, it's not quite up to date on its slang as I expected, but then again, its training data set only reaches until 2022, so it's kind of stale, if I say so myself. But yeah, it's a very powerful tool for doing research. Obviously, you should never take its words at face value, especially if you're planning on writing something, and you shouldn't copy paste the text from it either. This is just a template to help you understand your research topic and point you in the right direction. With regards to its writing, you probably shouldn't copy paste that as well, because as good as it is, it's not really high level. It's certainly lacking, especially when we talk about a college level paper, and its writing is quite flat at times. It lacks a certain flair. But with that being said, let's explore another aspect of what it can and can't do. All right, so here's another aspect that it can be used for, which is creative writing. Um, it's quite topical these days, using chatbots and AI in general to do the work of writers. And if you're aware, there's a writer strike in Hollywood right now, and this entire debate of whether this is ethical is a major talking point that's going on in those debates right now. Um, that being said, you can use it to draft scripts. You can use it to write dialogues, write stories, basically whatever you tell it to. Um, and the best example of this is when you ask it to write some kind of fan fiction. So let's try something like that. I'm not paying much attention to my spelling, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't care about spelling. Oh, it's writing an entire Marvel movie apparently. Um, let's see what it's done. As I can see, it as I the two sides that I gave it were both good guys. It kind of made them work together. I'll post this if anyone wants to read it. As I said, the writing is quite flat and usually very predictable. There's almost always, well, pretty much always a happy ending, and I believe that's something that the ChatGPT team has baked in because the internet especially has a reputation of um, taking chatbots and turning them into, well, monsters that are quite bigoted. So I understand why it, writes these happy endings, and quite predictable stories. I mean, you can use this to gain inspiration, but I don't think this would make a good movie if you put it onto the screen. Um, but then again, I want to demonstrate another aspect of exactly how you can manipulate this. So here's one. So just reading a couple of words. It's quite an interesting conversation. But what I wanted to highlight here was that I changed the actual output format by asking it to format it like a dialogue, which is what it did. So you have complete control over what kind of output it gives, as long as you stick to text. So that's part of the creative writing aspect. But let's get into more of the interesting part for our audience, which is the problem solving. All right, so let's talk about problem solving and utility when it comes to coding. Right? Um, Most people tend to misunderstand that when you give ChatGPT a coding question, it thinks logically about it. In fact, I've had some extended conversations that with friends who seem to think that there's some kind of code module or logic module involved. Well, it is a logic module. The whole thing is a logic module, but there's no specific system that generates code. It's not like an IDE auto generating your getters and setters or anything. It's still a large language model. And I think nowhere is this better exemplified than in the following scenario, right? I'm going to give it a prompt. And what I'm going to say is, can you act as a Linux terminal? So it said yes this time, but I've seen it refuse, right? And what's interesting about that is, um, you know, at points where it says that's not possible, or I'm not a Linux terminal, and this is due to the change in the responses is due to the change in technology as well. But the reason it might refuse to do something it can do is because it's just fx, it's just a function. It just takes your input and it does something with it and generates an output. It's not thinking logically at all here. um, that doesn't mean it can't generate logical outputs because it is a language model. But what you have to understand is the output it generates is based on its training data set. So if it says, no, I can't do something, it might not be because it actually can't do something. It might be because it saw something in its training data set where someone else or some other chatbot was saying it can't do anything. It can't do a similar task like that. So it just automatically defaulted to that response without actually trying, uh, quote unquote trying. So this Linux terminal feature is quite amazing. It's not a feature, but it's something, a side effect of this entire language model. So watch this. I'm just going to say ls. This might work or this might not work. Um, that is not what I wanted it to give. So let's tweak that output a little bit. Okay, now if I say ls, there you go. There's a list of directories. Let's make a new one. It seems to be a bit confused. So let me figure out what the exact prompt that was used for creating an almost perfect Linux terminal was and get back to you. So here is the command found to reliably generate a Linux terminal using ChatGPT. I got this from ARS Technica, and they should work quite well. Let's see. There you go. We got straight to the point. That's our working directory. And I want to stress right now, what's happening is ChatGPT is basically hallucinating a Linux server, a Linux terminal. There's no Linux kernel running anywhere. It's just me typing in responses, commands, and ChatGPT pretending to be a terminal. There's no actual kernel running here. So if I say ls, I mean it gives me a response as if I was in an actual machine, but it's not actually an actual machine. Um, I can do all sorts of things. I can make a directory. There's no output. But if I do ls again, that's the ChatGPT repository. And if I go into that and ls, I'm in an empty directory. But not really because none of this is real. Um, and of course, this is amazing because I can type in any input here and I can get an output. There's no dependency on me installing package managers and installing applications. It just knows what the output is going to be. For example, I can just create a new Angular application. Oh, that's weird. It actually wants me to install it. But let's try that. So again, this is based on the inputs that it's seen. So maybe it saw this in a stack on Stack Overflow and it's just parroting back what it saw. Not quite. Okay, it wants a password which I did not have. Let's just give it a random number. I know it's really difficult to believe that this isn't a real Linux terminal right now, but it's not. It's just it's just a simulation of one. Okay, yes. Right. Let's go with CSS. All right. Let's take a look here. Um, So it generated an Angular application, or quote unquote Angular application, and it has all these files apparently, but it doesn't have any of these files. They're not real. Um, let's try. Um, I'm not going to be able to exit Nano after this. And there's your package.json. Front end devs, if you want to validate any of this, go ahead. Um, so that was just, I mean, that this is really impressive, but that was just a morsel of what ChatGPT can really do. Let's get into, I mean, something like this might not come in useful very often, but let's get into things that it can be quite useful for in our day-to-day lives. All right, here's an Excel sheet with a bunch of data that was generated from an Excel template. Let's say we want to do something very menial and something that takes a very long time. Um, of course, it's something I could automate, and someone like me would probably spend more time automating it than just doing it manually would take. So I'm not sure which one is a bigger waste of time. But with something like ChatGPT, you could do, automate menial tasks instantly. For example, let's say I wanted a string that gave the item name, the description, and the unit price times 5 or something like that. Um, I mean, I could write a function in Excel and probably that wouldn't take much time, but that's not always the case. So let's try something. Let's take these things. Let's feed it into ChatGPT. And what I want to say is, so let's take this into ChatGPT. And what I want to say is, and there you go. It's doing all that. Um, Something like this is quite simple. It's just an example that I cooked up quite quickly, but I have found this very useful when I want to format large data sets. Of course, when formatting large data sets, please make sure that the outputs you're getting are actually valid, because once again, ChatGPT does lie and it does make mistakes. All right, that's enough of the menial labor. Let's get down to writing some code. I'm mainly a Java dev myself, so let's write something in Java. Um, let's keep it simple. I'll be honest with you. Um, this may or may not run, but this code quality is quite high. It modularized the code, it created methods, and it even gave comments. So, I mean, it is a very powerful tool for generating code. You can just give it a use case and it will generate the code in pretty much any language that's widely used. And you can tweak the code to your liking afterwards. I'm not going to check whether that works. I'll leave that up to your own experimentation with your own prompts. But for writing scripts, a very powerful tool. But I want to demonstrate that this is not only using the normal Java libraries, but you can do much more powerful things using it. All right, here's a powerful example of what it can do. Um, let's say I wanted to make an app that hits the Facebook API and saves what data it can to a database based on my profile. So I didn't specify a language this time and it chose Python out of the gate. And you also get a very concise description of what it just did. If I wanted to have it in Java instead, all I have to say is, and keep in mind, it can do that for any code. You can copy paste your code and ask it to convert it to any language that you want, and it'll do it, provided that there are analogs of the features that you use. All right, so that's the code in Java, but I don't actually want to use this library. Let's use try. Let's try using something else. And it even suggested the libraries that I should be using and the dependencies that I need. So, as you can see, with regards to code, it can do pretty much anything with a limited number of LOC. Of course, it can't run any of this, and none of this is guaranteed to run out of the gate. But you can debug, and it has done the majority of the legwork here. All right, so here's a site that we're all familiar with. Here's Stack Overflow. So we have a question here, and of course, there's an answer, but I'm not really satisfied with the explanation of this answer. So what I could do is I could add a comment and wait for this guy to answer and possibly get downvoted for asking a duplicate question. But instead, I could just copy this and hit enter. And there you go. There's a full explanation of what everything does and pretty much everything I need to know. And again, this might not be accurate, but it's a pretty good starting point, if not a pretty good explanation overall. And finally, I would like to demonstrate a feature that could be an absolute lifesaver, especially when you're in a time crunch, and that is the ability to debug code. So here's the implementation of a server that I wrote a very long time ago that uses sockets. And what I've done is I've taken this code and I've introduced a small bug to it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell ChatGPT, first I'm going to provide the code, and I'm going to tell it about the error that I've been having, the bug that I've been experiencing. And I can't say it found the exact error, but apparently it found an error that I didn't even see. I was using the wrong type of comparator. But um, I wonder if it will find the other one as well. Let's try and be more specific. And there you go, a perfect solution. It just analyzed that entire thing and it took microseconds. So I would have spent um, an hour on that, looking exactly where that error was. But with this, I just typed it in and told it what was wrong, and it fixed it. So um, and it knew what the expected behavior was. I didn't have to explain anything. It just read the code, it understood, and it generated the answer. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. And what I've demonstrated here are just a few of the capabilities that it has, and I hope this inspires you to find out what the other capabilities are of it. And because people are finding things every day, of course, again, it's a large language model. You should you should check the outputs. You shouldn't use raw outputs in anything, and you should cross-reference reliable sources, and don't use it for filing legal cases. As you know, um, it has been caught that ChatGPT has been used while filing legal cases, and it cited cases that don't exist, right? So it does that while coding too. It might use libraries that don't exist. It it might make up a new kind of statement, but that's just something that you have to be vigilant about. But I think that the trade-off is really worth it. So, before we actually, conclude and jump into the questions, I just want to address one concern that I've heard echoed over and over again. Is this the thin end of the wedge? Is this going to take our jobs or take over the world or, lead us into some other kind of dystopian future? And from what I've seen, no, this is just a really good tool that can benefit all of us. But then again, you really shouldn't be taking my word for it, considering I am biased because
I am not real. This entire presentation was done by generated voice. I just changed the present voice, while your real presenter plays video games. So for the frequently asked questions, how do you give a tech talk without actually speaking? Well, that's a question for another time. Thank you all for your attendance.